In 1892, a camp cook in northern Minnesota fed 84 men breakfast every morning, starting at 3:30 a.m. No one spoke during the meal. That was the rule. You sat down, you ate until your plate was empty, and you went into the woods to cut timber in the dark. The food he served is number 6 on this list. Number 17 was so calorie-dense that modern nutritionists calculated a single serving at over 1,400 calories. Number 3 was a technique so brutal and efficient that it has completely vanished from American cooking. These 25 breakfasts were not designed to taste good. They were designed to keep men alive while doing the most physically dangerous job in North America. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 25 rugged lumberjack breakfasts that logging camps actually ate before dawn. Number 25, black coffee by the bucket. Before anything else hit the table, there was coffee. Not a cup, not a pot, a bucket. Camp cooks brewed coffee in 10-gallon kettles, using a fistful of grounds per gallon, boiled hard until the liquid turned the color of creek mud after a rainstorm. Some cooks threw in a raw egg, shell and all, to settle the grounds to the bottom. Others crushed eggshells into the pot, believing the calcium cut the bitterness. The coffee was so strong that New Jack said it could strip varnish off a saw handle. It sat on the stove from 3 a.m. until the last man finished eating, growing thicker and more punishing by the hour. A pound of Arbuckle's coffee cost about 15 cents in the 1880s, and a camp might burn through 5 pounds a day. Nobody complained about the taste. You drank it because the alternative was walking into a frozen forest at 4 a.m. without it. Coffee was not a beverage in a logging camp. It was a prerequisite for survival. Number 24, salt pork and fried bread. When a camp was too remote for regular supply wagons, salt pork was the foundation of every meal, breakfast included. The cook would slice thick slabs from a barrel of cured pork belly, fry them in a cast iron skillet the size of a wagon wheel, then use the rendered fat to fry rough chunks of bread dough until they puffed golden and crisp. The bread soaked up the pork grease like a sponge, and men ate it with their hands, alternating bites of chewy salt pork with bites of fried bread. The combination was greasy, salty, and heavy enough to sit in your stomach for hours. A barrel of salt pork cost roughly $12 in 1885 and could last a crew of 30 men about 2 weeks. Nothing about this breakfast was subtle. It hit you like a falling pine, and that was exactly the point. Number 23, molasses on everything. Molasses was the lumberjack's sugar, his syrup, and his dessert rolled into one dark, sticky barrel that sat in the corner of every cook shanty in the North Woods. Men poured it over flapjacks, stirred it into oatmeal, drizzled it across salt pork, and spooned it straight from the barrel when nobody was looking. A gallon of blackstrap molasses cost about 30 cents at frontier prices and provided iron, calcium, and a surge of quick energy that processed sugar could not match. In camps across Wisconsin and Michigan, the molasses barrel needed refilling every week. The cook guarded it with the same suspicion a bartender guards the till. Men who used too much got a look that could split birch, but molasses made the monotony bearable. When every breakfast tasted the same, that dark sweetness was the only thing that changed from plate to plate. Number 22, boiled oats. A 50-pound sack of rolled oats cost about $1 in the 1890s and fed a crew for the better part of a month. The cook would dump oats into a massive pot of boiling water the night before, let them cook down into a thick gray porridge, then reheat the whole thing before dawn. Served plain, it was wallpaper paste. Served with molasses, salt pork drippings, or a splash of canned milk, it became fuel. The starch broke down slowly in the stomach, providing sustained energy through hours of swinging an axe in sub-zero temperatures. Logging companies in Maine and Minnesota listed oats on their supply requisitions by the ton, not by the sack, by the ton. One camp in Bemidji, Minnesota, reportedly consumed 1,200 pounds of oats in a single winter season. Men ate it without enthusiasm and without complaint, because complaining about food in a logging camp was a good way to find yourself without any. Number 21. Fried side meat with pan gravy. Side meat, the cheaper, fattier cousin of bacon, came in slabs that the cook carved each morning. He would slice it thick, lay the pieces across a griddle, and let them render until the edges crisped and the fat pooled deep enough to cook in. When the meat came off, flour went into the grease, stirred hard until it browned. Then water or coffee was poured in to make a rough gravy. The gravy went over biscuits, over bread, over anything that would hold it. Side meat cost about 8 cents a pound in the 1880s, roughly half the price of proper bacon. The taste was heavier, fattier, with none of the sweetness that sugar-cured bacon carried. Nobody in a logging camp cared. Fat was fuel. Every drop of grease was a calorie that kept a man standing upright in a blizzard. Logging camp cooks judged their breakfasts by one standard only. Could a man work 12 hours after eating it without falling down? Side meat and gravy passed that test every single morning. Number 20, stewed dried apples. Dried apples arrived in logging camps packed in burlap sacks, shriveled and leathery and smelling faintly of autumn. The cook would simmer them overnight in water with a scoop of sugar or molasses until they softened into a thick, sweet compote that steamed on the breakfast table in iron pots. In camps where fresh fruit never appeared between October and April, stewed apples were the only thing standing between a crew and scurvy. 1 pound of dried apples cost about 10 cents and swelled to nearly 3 pounds when rehydrated. Men ate them alongside flapjacks, spooned them over oatmeal, or just scooped them straight from the pot with a chunk of bread. The tartness cut through the grease of every other item on the table. In the relentless parade of pork, bread, and coffee, dried apples were the closest thing to gentleness that breakfast ever offered. Number 19. Baked beans from the bean hole. Some camps cooked their beans underground. The cook would dig a pit, build a hardwood fire inside it, let the coals burn down for hours, then lower in a cast-iron Dutch oven packed with navy beans, salt pork, molasses, and mustard. The pit was covered with dirt and left overnight. By 3 a.m., those beans had baked for 10 to 12 hours in trapped heat, turning creamy and dark and deeply smoky without anyone tending them. The technique came from indigenous cooking traditions, and New England settlers carried it straight into the timber camps of the Northeast. 100 pounds of dried navy beans cost about $3 in the 1880s. Beanhole beans appeared at breakfast as often as dinner because they were ready when the cook was not. They sat in their own pot, held their heat, and asked nothing of anyone. For a cook feeding 60 men before sunrise, that independence was worth more than flavor. Number 18. Sourdough hotcakes stacked high. First pattern break. Here is where things get serious. The flapjack was the king of the logging camp breakfast, and the sourdough starter was its crown. Every camp cook carried a crock of living starter, a bubbling paste of flour, water, and wild yeast that he protected like a firstborn child. In northern Wisconsin and Minnesota, cooks slept with their starter crocks to keep them from freezing overnight. A dead starter meant no flapjacks, and no flapjacks meant a near mutiny. The cook would pull starter before dawn, Mix it with flour, eggs if he had them, a pinch of saleratus for lift, and pour the batter onto a greased griddle in circles the size of dinner plates. A single lumberjack might eat 10 to 15 flapjacks in one sitting, stacked high and drenched in molasses or cane syrup. Camp records from the Weyerhaeuser operations in the 1890s show cooks producing over 500 flapjacks per morning for a crew of 50. The sourdough gave them a tang that commercial yeast could not replicate, a sourness that lingered under the sweetness and made men reach for just one more. That starter traveled from camp to camp, season to season, sometimes surviving for decades. When a cook retired, he passed his starter to his replacement the way a father passes a pocket watch. It was the most valuable thing in the kitchen. Number 17. Fried donuts by the crate. The logging camp donut was not the glazed ring from a bakery case. It was a fist-sized ball of sweetened dough dropped into a cauldron of boiling lard until it turned mahogany brown and split open at the seams. Camp cooks made them by the hundreds. A single donut fried in lard contained upward of 400 calories. Men grabbed 3 or 4 from the pile and stuffed them into coat pockets for the walk to the cutting site, eating them mid-morning when the cold had burned through breakfast. The nutritional profile was staggering. A man eating 4 donuts before dawn consumed over 1,400 calories before he ever picked up an axe. Logging companies did not see this as excess. They saw it as cost-effective fuel. The ingredients, flour, sugar, lard, and eggs, were among the cheapest in the supply wagon. The return on investment was a workforce that could fell 200 trees before noon. Modern nutritionists would call this reckless. The men who ate them called it Tuesday. Number 16. Corned beef hash. When a camp had access to canned corned beef, and by the 1880s most did, the cook would chop it fine with boiled potatoes and onions, press the mixture flat into a scorching hot skillet, and let the bottom develop a thick, dark crust before flipping it in sections. The crust was the entire point. That caramelized layer of meat and starch held together like a savory pancake and delivered a flavor that boiled potatoes alone never could. A can of corned beef cost about 20 cents. 2 cans and a bucket of potatoes fed 30 men. The hash sat heavy and warm in the gut, releasing energy slowly across the morning. In camps where fresh beef appeared only when a supply wagon made it through, canned corned beef was the reliable constant that kept breakfast from collapsing into nothing but bread and coffee. The cook who could produce a perfect crust on his hash earned a reputation that followed him from camp to camp like a letter of recommendation. Number 15. Johnny Cake. Cornmeal batter poured thin onto a greased griddle and cooked until the edges turned lacy and brown. Johnny Cakes were faster than flapjacks, cheaper than biscuits, and tough enough to survive a morning in a coat pocket without falling apart. The name likely came from journey cake, bread made for travel. In camps across New England and the upper Midwest, cornmeal cost roughly half the price of wheat flour, and cooks who managed tight budgets used it wherever they could. The cakes were dense, slightly gritty, and carried a sweetness that wheat bread could not match. Men broke them apart and dragged them through bean juice, through gravy, through whatever liquid was on the plate. They were utility food in its purest form, designed not to impress, but to function. Number 14. Head cheese. This entry makes modern stomachs turn, but in logging camps, nothing from a slaughtered hog went to waste. Head cheese was made by simmering a pig's head, sometimes with the feet, for hours until every scrap of meat fell from the bone and the broth turned thick with natural gelatin. The cook would pick the meat, season it with vinegar, salt, pepper, and sage, pack it into a pan, pour the broth over it, and let it set firm overnight in the cold. By morning, it's sliced clean and held together like cold cuts. Men ate it on bread or straight from the plate with a fork. A pig's head cost almost nothing because nobody else wanted it. The logging camp cook wanted it because it fed 20 men for 2 mornings from an ingredient the butcher was practically giving away. The taste was rich, porky, and faintly sour from the vinegar. It was an honest food made from an honest animal by men who understood that waste was a sin they could not afford. Number 13, fried potatoes by the bushel. Potatoes were the only vegetable that survived the journey to remote logging camps intact. They arrived by the wagon load, stored in root cellars, dug into frozen ground, and appeared at breakfast sliced thick and fried in whatever fat the cook had on hand. A bushel of potatoes cost about 40 cents in the 1880s. The cook would start them in a skillet before anything else, letting them soften slowly in pork fat while he prepared the rest of breakfast. By the time men sat down, the potatoes had crisped into golden, salt-crusted slabs that crunched when you bit into them and melted once they hit your tongue. No seasoning beyond salt, no technique beyond patience. Potatoes were the only item on the breakfast table that reminded men of home cooking, of their mother's kitchen, of the farms most of them had left behind to earn winter wages in the timber. Number 12, red flannel hash, second pattern break. Here is a meal born entirely from leftovers and stubbornness. Red flannel hash got its name from the beets that gave the entire dish a deep crimson stain. Leftover boiled beets, potatoes, onions, and whatever meat was available from the night before were chopped together and fried hard in a skillet until the bottom formed a crust, almost black with caramelization. The beets bled their color into the potatoes and the meat, turning the entire pan the shade of a lumberjack's winter long johns. The flavor was earthy, sweet from the beets, savory from the meat, and smoky from the cast iron. Logging camps in Vermont and New Hampshire made this regularly because beets stored as well as potatoes through the winter and cost almost nothing. A bushel of beets was about 30 cents. The dish looked alarming to outsiders, a plate of crimson mush, but men who ate it knew the beets provided iron and vitamins that the rest of their diet sorely lacked. Every forkful was nourishment disguised as leftovers. Number 11, pea soup thick enough to hold a spoon. Dried split peas cooked overnight in the back of the cook stove with a ham bone or a chunk of salt pork until they dissolved completely into a thick, pale green porridge. By breakfast, the soup had reduced to something closer to pudding than liquid. The cook ladled it into bowls, and men ate it with bread, using the bread as both utensil and plate. A 50-pound sack of dried peas cost about $2.50 and lasted weeks. The soup delivered protein, fiber, and a warmth that started in the chest and radiated outward through frozen limbs. In French-Canadian logging camps across Quebec and northern Maine, pea soup was the breakfast that defined the culture. Cooks called it soupe au pois, and every one of them made it slightly different. A pinch of savory here, a bay leaf there, but the foundation never changed. Dried peas, pork, water, time. Number 10, eggs by the case. When a supply wagon delivered eggs, the camp cook treated that morning like Christmas. He would crack them by the dozen into cast iron skillets the size of shields, frying them in pools of lard until the whites set firm and the yolks stayed runny enough to soak into bread. A case of eggs, 30 dozen, cost about $4 in the 1890s and might last a large camp 2 mornings. Men who had not seen a fresh egg in weeks ate them with a kind of quiet reverence, mopping up every trace of yolk with whatever bread was available. Eggs were the luxury item of the logging camp breakfast table, appearing just often enough to remind men what real food tasted like, and disappearing just quickly enough to make them miss it. Number 9. Venison steaks before dawn. In remote camps where supply lines stretched thin, hunting supplemented the pantry. When a deer was taken, the cook carved the backstrap into thick steaks and fried them fast over high heat in the pre-dawn darkness. The meat was lean, iron-rich, and tasted of the same forest the men were about to spend the day cutting down. Venison appeared at breakfast without ceremony. It was simply what was available, cooked quickly and served alongside whatever else the cook had going. The men who hunted the deer the day before ate with particular satisfaction, knowing their work had fed the crew. Camp journals from Michigan's Upper Peninsula record deer harvests, contributing as much as a third of the camp's winter protein. No one called it farm to table. They called it eating. Number 8. Biscuits by the pan. A good camp cook could produce 200 biscuits before most men opened their eyes. Flour, lard, salt, baking powder, and buttermilk, if available, or water if not, mixed fast and were cut with the rim of a tin cup into rough circles, then baked in sheet pans inside a cast iron stove until they rose tall and golden. Third pattern break. The biscuit was the universal vehicle of the logging camp breakfast. It carried gravy, soaked up bean liquid, held fried meat, and served as a spoon when a man's hands were too cold or too cut up to hold real utensils. A 100-pound barrel of flour cost about $4 in the 1880s. From that single barrel, a skilled cook could produce over 1,000 biscuits. The math mattered because logging companies tracked food costs per man per day with the same precision they tracked board feet of lumber per acre. A biscuit cost roughly a fraction of a cent to produce. The labor it fueled was worth dollars. That equation kept camp kitchens running 7 days a week all winter long. Number 7. Blood sausage. Hog butchering day in a logging camp produced blood sausage that appeared at the breakfast table the next morning. The cook mixed fresh pig blood with oats, diced onion, salt, and spices, packed the mixture into cleaned intestines, and simmered the links until firm. Sliced thick and fried until the outside crackled, blood sausage delivered a mineral-rich, deeply savory protein that sustained Scandinavian and German lumberjacks who had grown up eating it in the old country. Finnish loggers in Minnesota called it veriohukaiset when made into pancakes instead of sausage. Irish loggers called it black pudding. The name changed, but the principle stayed the same. Blood was nutrition too valuable to pour onto the ground. A single hog's worth of blood produced enough sausage for several mornings of breakfast. The taste was earthy, almost metallic, with a richness that conventional sausage could not approach. Men either loved it or endured it. Either way, they ate it. Number 6. The full lumber camp spread. This was the breakfast served by that cook in northern Minnesota who fed 84 men in silence every morning. The full spread was not a single dish. It was an event. The table, a plank surface sometimes 40 feet long, was loaded before the men arrived. Flapjack stacks, fried salt pork, baked beans, boiled potatoes, fried donuts, biscuits, molasses, stewed fruit, oatmeal, and coffee. All of it at once, all of it expected. Men sat down on benches, ate in complete silence per camp rules, and were finished in 15 minutes. The silence rule existed because talking slowed eating, and slow eating delayed work. The cook and his helpers, called cookies, had been awake since 2 a.m. preparing this arsenal of calories. A single breakfast service for a crew of 80 consumed roughly 50 pounds of flour, 20 pounds of pork, 10 pounds of beans, and 5 gallons of coffee. The cost was calculated at roughly 15 to 20 cents per man per meal. Logging companies paid it without argument because a well-fed crew produced more timber than a hungry one, and a hungry crew was a crew that walked off the job. Number 5. Smoked pork chops. When a logging camp had access to a smokehouse, pork chops were cured and smoked in batches that lasted through the coldest weeks of winter. The cook would pull chops from the hanging rack and sear them fast on the griddle, letting the smoke flavor intensify against the hot iron. The meat came out slightly pink in the center, the edges blackened and salty, with a perfume that cut through the smell of wood smoke and pine pitch that otherwise defined every waking moment. Smoked pork chops were a cut above the daily salt pork, a small upgrade that signaled the camp was well provisioned and the foreman knew how to keep men satisfied. A whole hog purchased from a nearby farmer cost about $5 in the 1880s. Smoked and rationed carefully, it stretched across weeks of breakfasts, each chop a reminder that someone in the operation cared enough to plan ahead. Number 4. Baked bean sandwiches. Cold leftover baked beans spread thick between 2 slabs of bread, wrapped in cloth and stuffed into a coat pocket. This was not a sit-down breakfast. This was the breakfast men ate, walking to the cutting site in the dark, tearing off bites with one hand while the other held a lantern or steadied them on an icy trail. The beans froze almost solid in the pocket within minutes, and men would wedge the sandwich inside their shirt against their chest to keep it warm enough to chew. Bean sandwiches were the portable breakfast of the North Woods, engineered for movement, not comfort. They delivered protein, carbohydrates, and fat in a single handheld package that required no plate, no utensil, and no time. The cook made them by the dozen, wrapping each one the same way, lining them up on the serving table beside the door so men could grab one without breaking stride. Number 3. Lumberjack stew for breakfast. Here is the technique that has vanished. In camps where the cook needed maximum calories in minimum time, he would take whatever meat was available, cube it small, brown it hard, then add potatoes, onions, turnips, and water to the same pot and boil the entire thing into a thick, starchy stew that was served at 4 a.m. as breakfast. Not lunch, not dinner, breakfast. The stew had been cooking since midnight, the meat falling apart, and the vegetables dissolving into a broth so thick it clung to the ladle. Men ate 2 or 3 bowls, soaking up the last of it with bread, and walked into the woods carrying enough fuel to swing an axe for 6 straight hours before the midday meal arrived by sled. Modern Americans do not eat stew for breakfast. The idea feels wrong, almost transgressive. But for men burning 7,000 to 9,000 calories a day in temperatures that dipped below -30, the distinction between breakfast food and dinner food was a luxury they could not afford. They ate what gave them power. Stew gave them power. Number 2, pork and pancake stack. This was not pork served alongside pancakes. This was pork layered between pancakes, a stack of alternating flapjacks and fried salt pork slices, 5 or 6 layers high, drowned in molasses and eaten with a knife and fork like a savory cake. The combination delivered an almost obscene concentration of fat, starch, and sugar in a single vertical structure that could sustain a 200-pound man through a morning of pulling a crosscut saw through frozen white pine. Some camps called it a lumber pile, some called it a shanty stack. The name did not matter. What mattered was that it worked. A man who ate a full stack at 4 a.m. was still standing at noon. A man who did not was not. The cook who invented this understood something that modern nutrition has spent decades overcomplicating. Hard labor demands hard food, simple as a felled tree. Number 1, flapjacks and everything. The lumberjack breakfast that defined the entire era was not a single dish. It was an attitude. Flapjacks as the foundation, piled high with every available calorie source on the table surrounding them. Pork, beans, potatoes, donuts, eggs when they existed, gravy, molasses, coffee strong enough to wake the dead. The cook did not ask what men wanted. He put it all out and let them build their own breakfast from the wreckage. This was the meal that fueled the industry that built American cities. The timber that framed houses in Chicago, Minneapolis, and Detroit was cut by men who ate this breakfast in the dark, in silence, in camps that smelled of pine resin and lard and coffee and frozen wool. Every board foot of lumber that crossed the Great Lakes was paid for twice, once in dollars and once in flapjacks. The men who ate them are gone. The forests they cut are gone. But the breakfast survives in photographs and journals and the fading memories of families who still tell the stories. Here is my challenge. Make one of these this week. The sourdough hotcakes, the baked beans from a Dutch oven, the corned beef hash with a proper crust. Then sit down and eat it before the sun comes up and see if it changes your morning. Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know if the pork and pancake stack gets more love than the bean-hole beans. Because these were not just breakfasts, they were the fuel that built a nation, one tree at a time.